right, settle in. Let the noise of your day begin to fade into the background. Like a distant conversation you're no longer required to participate in. There's nothing left for you to do but breathe and listen to a quiet story from a very, very long time ago. A time when the world was a lot bigger and a lot more mysterious. And, as it turns out, a lot more susceptible to some very bad ideas in shipping management. We're going to drift back to the middle of the 14th century. The year is 1347, a time of knights and castles and a rather spectacular lack of basic sanitation. It was a perfectly ordinary time in that most people were just trying to get by without starving or being invaded. Our story begins not in the grand halls of Europe, but far to the east on the shores of the Black Sea. There, on the Crimean Peninsula, was the city of Caffa. It was a bustling, noisy, and probably very smelly trading post run by merchants from Genoa. These Genoese traders were the undisputed champions of Mediterranean commerce. They were sharp, they were savvy, and they would sail just about anywhere if there was a profit to be made. Caffa was their golden goose, a gateway to the Silk Road where the riches of the Orient were funneled west. For years, things had been going splendidly. Spices, silks, and other luxuries flowed through the port, making a great many people very wealthy. But there was a small problem. And that problem was the Mongol army, known then as the Golden Horde. The local Mongol leader, Johnny Beg, had a disagreement with the Genoese merchants. These sorts of disagreements usually involved taxes, territory, or some other perceived slight that was, in the grand scheme of things, not worth mentioning. Johnny Beg, however, was not one for lengthy negotiations. He decided the best way to resolve the dispute was to simply conquer the city of Caffa. So, in 1346, his army laid siege to the walled port, cutting it off from the outside world. This was, of course, a major inconvenience for the Genoese, who were much better at haggling than they were at siege warfare. The siege dragged on. The Mongols couldn't break the city's defenses, and the Genoese couldn't exactly leave. It was a stalemate, a very boring, very tense stalemate. But then something unexpected happened. The Mongol army started getting sick, very, very sick. A mysterious illness swept through their camp, a malady of fevers, chills, and strange, painful swellings. Soldiers were dying in droves. Their grand siege was collapsing from the inside out, thanks to an enemy they couldn't see and certainly couldn't fight. It was at this point that Johnny Beg had a moment of, let's call it, malicious inspiration. He was losing his army, and the city was still standing. It all seemed terribly unfair. He decided that if his army was going to suffer, then so should the Genoese. Using his giant catapults, his trebuchet, he began launching the corpses of his plague-ridden soldiers over the walls and into the city of Caffa. It was a truly desperate and, frankly, a revolting act of biological warfare, centuries before anyone had even heard of the term. The people inside Caffa were horrified. Not only was it a psychologically terrifying tactic, but soon they too began to fall ill with the same mysterious sickness. The city, which had been a sanctuary, was quickly becoming a tomb. The air filled with the stench of death, and the survivors grew more and more desperate. The dream of Eastern riches had turned into a full-blown nightmare. Some of the Genoese merchants saw the writing on the wall, or perhaps they saw the corpses on the trebuchet. Either way, they knew it was time to leave. Under the cover of darkness, a handful of trading galleys, 12 of them, the stories say, managed to slip out of the harbor, past the dying Mongol army, and out into the relative safety of the Black Sea. They had escaped. They were heading home, back to Italy, with tales of horror, and, they hoped, a hold full of whatever cargo they'd managed to save. They were leaving the plague behind them, or so they thought. The problem, you see, is that they weren't just carrying spices and silk. Unseen, unnoticed, they had a few extra passengers, a few black rats, carrying a few infected fleas, and in the blood of the sailors themselves, the pestilence was already beginning its silent, deadly work.
The journey from the Black Sea to Italy was a long one. Weeks of sailing across open water at the mercy of the winds. For the crews of the Genoese ships, it should have been a voyage of relief, a slow decompression after the horrors of the siege. But any sense of relief they might have felt was quickly evaporating. Within days of leaving Caffa, the first sailor fell ill. He was struck by a sudden fever, his body racked with aches and chills. The ship's surgeon, who likely knew more about bloodletting than anything else, would have been baffled. Then came the telltale sign, a hard, swollen lump, or bubo, in his groin or armpit. It was agonizingly painful, and soon turned a dark, bruised purple-black. From this symptom, the disease would later get its famous, terrifying name, the Black Death. But for now, it was just a nameless horror. The first sick sailor died within days, then 2 more fell ill, and then another. Panic began to creep through the ships, cold and quiet. They were in the middle of the sea, with nowhere to run. They had escaped the Mongols, only to find a far more insidious enemy had come with them. The sailors would have tried their best to carry on, to man the sails and keep their course for home. But their numbers were dwindling. Each morning, more bodies would be unceremoniously dropped into the sea, a silent funeral procession marking their slow, grim passage westward. Their first major stop was the grand city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, a glittering jewel of a city. It was the gateway between Europe and Asia. When the Genoese galleys limped into the Golden Horn, they must have been a dreadful sight. The remaining crew would have been gaunt, exhausted, and terrified. They brought news of the siege at Caffa, and perhaps tried to trade what little they had, but they also brought the sickness. It didn't take long for the people of Constantinople to realize that a strange and deadly plague had arrived with these ships. The city, with its crowded streets and bustling markets, was a perfect breeding ground for the disease. Within weeks, the emperor's own son was dead, and the plague began to carve its way through the population. The Genoese ships were likely forced to leave. No port wanted them. They became pariahs, ghost ships, sailing from island to island, from harbor to harbor, looking for a place to land, a place to get help. But everywhere they went, the story was the same. Rumors traveled faster than they did. The sight of their sails on the horizon, which once would have been a welcome sign of commerce, now sparked terror. They were turned away from Greece. They were denied entry at port after port in the Aegean Sea. Imagine the desperation on board. Surrounded by the dead and dying, with dwindling supplies of food and fresh water, and with every potential safe harbor slamming its doors in their faces. The dream of returning home to family and fortune was dying, one sailor at a time. The ships eventually scattered, some may have sunk, their entire crews lost to the pestilence, becoming true ghost ships, drifting aimlessly until the sea claimed them. But a few pressed on, driven by the last vestiges of hope, or perhaps just the instinct to keep moving. They set their course for Italy, for Sicily to be exact. It was October of 1347 when one of these galleys, a single ship from the original fleet, was spotted off the coast of Messina. The people of the Sicilian port city would have seen it approach with cautious optimism. A trade ship meant goods. It meant news from the east. They had no idea what actually was coming. They had no idea they were about to open the door to a devastation unlike anything Europe had ever known. The ship was eerily quiet as it approached the dock. There were not enough sailors on deck to properly handle the sails. The few men who could be seen were stumbling, spectral figures, clearly suffering from some terrible affliction. They were, the accounts say, already in the grip of death. Yet the authorities in Messina allowed them to dock. Perhaps it was out of pity. Perhaps it was greed for the cargo they carried. Or perhaps it was simply an inability to comprehend the scale of the danger they were facing. Whatever the reason, the gangplank was lowered, and with it, the plague took its first fateful steps onto European soil. The few rats that had survived the journey scurried down the ropes and into the city's warehouses, disappearing into the shadows. The long, slow voyage was over. The catastrophe was just beginning.
The port of Messina was, like most medieval cities, a tightly packed maze of narrow streets, workshops, and homes, all crammed together. It was a place where people lived on top of one another, sharing their space with livestock, waste, and a thriving population of black rats. It was, in hindsight, the perfect environment for a plague to make its grand debut. When the Genoese ship docked, the people of Messina were initially overcome with a mix of horror and pity for the dying sailors. They brought them food and water, tending to the sick as best they knew how. This, of course, was a terrible mistake. The disease spread with shocking speed. It moved from the sailors to their caregivers, and then into their families, and then out into the wider city. The symptoms were terrifying and completely alien. The fever, the aches, the exhaustion, followed by the appearance of the buboes. These swellings could grow to the size of an apple and were excruciatingly painful. After the buboes, dark blotches would often appear on the skin, caused by internal bleeding. From the first sign of fever to the final breath, it often took only 3 to 5 days. The people of Messina had no name for it, no cure for it, and no defense against it. They were utterly helpless. The city's physicians, relying on ancient texts and theories of bodily humors, were useless. They tried bleeding patients, lancing the buboes, and prescribing herbal remedies. Nothing worked. As the death toll mounted, a creeping dread turned into outright panic. People started to die in the streets. The city's bells, which normally rang for church services or celebrations, began to toll constantly for funerals. Soon there were too many dead to bury properly. Carts would be piled high with bodies, which were then dumped into mass graves dug outside the city walls.
The social fabric of Messina began to tear apart. People abandoned their sick family members, terrified of catching the illness. Priests refused to give last rites. Notaries refused to witness the wills of the dying. The city was shutting down, consumed by fear and the ever-present reality of death. The people of Messina finally realized their mistake. The Genoese ship, the source of their misery, had to go. The city authorities, in a belated and desperate act of public health, ordered the ship out of their harbor. With its few remaining dying sailors, the galley was cast out, forced back to sea to meet its fate. But it was too late. The rats were ashore. The fleas had found new hosts. The disease was now firmly rooted in Messina. As the ghost ship drifted away, the people of Messina who were still healthy began to flee the city, hoping to escape the pestilence. They scattered across the island of Sicily, taking refuge in villages and neighboring towns. In doing so, they unknowingly carried the plague with them, spreading it to every corner of the island. The city of Catania to the south soon fell victim. Then Syracuse. Sicily was being consumed. The news of the mysterious plague in Sicily began to spread to mainland Italy. It was spoken of in hushed and fearful tones by sailors and merchants, but it still seemed like a distant problem. An island tragedy. The great cities of the Italian peninsula, Genoa, Pisa, Venice, continued their business, confident in their wealth and power. They heard the stories from Messina of a ship of dead men and a disease that killed in days, but it was easy to dismiss such things as exaggerated sailors' tales. They had no idea that the plague was already on the move, traveling in the cargo holds of the very ships that brought them these rumors. The Black Death had established a beachhead, and now it was preparing to invade the continent. Winter was approaching, which should have slowed the spread. Fleas are less active in the cold, but this plague seemed to defy the seasons. It found its way into the warm, crowded homes and hovels of the poor, passed from person to person. And there was another and even more terrifying form of the disease appearing. Some victims didn't develop buboes at all. Instead, they developed a cough and began spitting up blood. This was the pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs and could spread directly from person to person through the air. It was even more deadly, with a mortality rate of nearly 100%. The ghost ship was gone, but its legacy was multiplying, preparing to cross the strait and fall upon an unsuspecting Europe.
By the beginning of 1348, the plague had crossed the narrow Strait of Messina and landed on the toe of Italy. From there, it began its relentless march north. It traveled at the speed of commerce, hitching rides on coastal trading vessels and in the saddlebags of merchants. One of the first major ports to fall was Genoa. Ironically, the very city that had sent the traders to Caffa in the first place now found itself under siege from the plague they had brought back. The Genoese authorities, having heard the horror stories from their own returning sailors, tried to prevent any suspect ships from docking. They used burning arrows to drive them away, a desperate and ultimately futile gesture. The disease, as always, found a way in. From Genoa, it spread to Pisa, and from there, it struck the magnificent city of Florence, the heart of the Renaissance. It was in Florence that the plague was perhaps best documented, thanks to writers like Giovanni Boccaccio, who described the city's collapse in his book, The Decameron. He wrote of the complete breakdown of law and order, He described how the sick were left to die alone, and how the dead were collected by lowly workers who piled them onto carts like, in his words, bales of merchandise. Healthy people did their best to avoid any contact with the sick. They would lock themselves in their homes or flee to the countryside, but there was no escape. The plague followed them. As the pestilence swept through Italy, nobody understood what was happening. The concept of germ theory was still 500 years in the future. Lacking a scientific explanation, people turned to other ideas. The most common theory was that of miasma, or bad air. It was believed that the plague was caused by a foul-smelling, corrupted vapor that rose from the earth, perhaps triggered by an earthquake or the unfortunate alignment of the planets. Physicians advised people to carry sweet-smelling flowers or herbs, a posy to ward off the bad air. They burned incense in their homes and lit massive bonfires in the streets to purify the atmosphere. Of course, none of this did anything to stop the fleas or the rats. It just made the world smell a bit nicer while everything fell apart. Another popular explanation was that the plague was a form of divine punishment. It was God's wrath visited upon a sinful world. In response, people flocked to churches, praying for deliverance. Religious processions snaked through the streets with people whipping themselves in public displays of penance. These groups, known as flagellants, traveled from town to town, believing their suffering could appease an angry God. Unfortunately, these large public gatherings of terrified, unwashed people were the perfect way to spread a highly contagious disease. Instead of stopping the plague, they likely helped it move even faster. The road to hell, it seems, was paved with good, if rather misguided, intentions. Meanwhile, the plague continued its journey. From the port of Pisa, it boarded ships bound for Marseille in France. By the spring of 1348, it was tearing through southern France. It followed the Rhone River valley north, reaching the city of Avignon, which at the time was the home of the Pope. The papal court was thrown into chaos. The Pope's own physician, a man named Guy de Chauliac, became one of the few to catch the plague and actually survive. He documented the symptoms meticulously, but even he could only recommend that the Pope protect himself by sitting between two enormous fires, day and night, even in the heat of summer. It was a classic miasma theory treatment, and it might have accidentally worked, not by purifying the air, but by creating a heat so intense that it kept any plague-carrying fleas at a comfortable distance. The world seemed to be ending. The economy was grinding to a halt. Fields went unplowed, harvests rotted, and workshops fell silent. The bonds of society, which had seemed so strong, were proving to be incredibly fragile. Parents abandoned children, husbands abandoned wives. The only thing that truly thrived was the plague itself. It was efficient, it was relentless, and it was completely indiscriminate. It killed the rich and the poor, the pious and the sinner, the old and the young. It had arrived on a handful of ships, a terrible secret from the east. And now, less than a year after landing in Messina, it had brought the proud and powerful continent of Europe to its knees.
Having thoroughly established itself in Italy and France, the plague decided it was time to see the rest of the continent. It was a remarkably effective tourist. In the summer of 1348, it crossed the English Channel. It's believed to have arrived in England at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset, aboard a ship carrying a cargo of wine from Gascony, France. From this single entry point, it began to spread through the English countryside. The villages of the West Country were the first to suffer. The plague moved along the primitive road system from village to town, from town to city. By autumn, it had reached London. London, at the time, was a city of around 70,000 people. It was notoriously crowded, filthy, and, like all medieval cities, overflowing with rats.
The plague hit London like a tidal wave. The city's small cemeteries were overwhelmed within weeks. New plague pits had to be dug outside the city walls to handle the sheer volume of the dead. One such emergency burial ground at Smithfield would eventually hold thousands upon thousands of bodies stacked in neat, anonymous layers. Life in the city ground to a standstill. King Edward III, who was a rather effective monarch in most respects, was completely powerless. He issued orders to clean the streets, hoping to combat the corrupt air. It was a good idea in general, but it did nothing to slow the disease. He even suspended Parliament for a time, which might have been the most popular decision he ever made. But the plague didn't care about politics. It just kept spreading. From England, it moved north into Scotland and across the sea to Ireland. At the same time, it was also moving through Spain and Portugal, having arrived by sea from France. The Kingdom of Aragon was hit particularly hard. King Peter IV lost his wife, his daughter, and his niece in the space of 6 months. In the rest of Europe, the plague traveled eastward from France into the Holy Roman Empire, the collection of states that would one day become Germany. It moved up the Rhine River, city by city. It was a slow, creeping invasion. People in cities further east would hear rumors of the horror coming their way, giving them months to prepare. But it made no difference. There was no way to stop it. No wall was high enough, no army strong enough. As the despair deepened, people began looking for someone to blame. God was too abstract, and bad air was too intangible. A scapegoat was needed, and in many parts of Europe, particularly in Germany and France, the blame fell upon the Jewish communities. Wild, baseless rumors began to circulate that the Jews had caused the plague by poisoning the wells. It was nonsense, of course. Jewish communities were often dying from the plague at the same rate as their Christian neighbors, but fear and prejudice are a potent combination. A wave of horrific persecutions followed. Entire Jewish populations were rounded up and massacred in cities like Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne. They were burned alive, their property was seized, and they were blamed for a catastrophe that was biological, not conspiratorial. By 1349, the plague had reached Scandinavia, supposedly arriving in Norway on yet another ghost ship. The story goes that a ship from England laden with wool drifted into the harbor at Bergen. When the locals went to investigate, they found the entire crew dead. Eager for the valuable cargo, they unloaded the wool and in doing so unleashed the plague on Norway. From there it went to Sweden and Denmark. It also pushed further east through Austria and Hungary and eventually into Russia. Within 3 years of its arrival in Sicily, the Black Death had touched nearly every corner of the continent. It had traveled from the shores of the Black Sea to the fjords of Norway, leaving a trail of unimaginable devastation in its wake. It was the single greatest mortality event in recorded history, and it all started with a few rats on a handful of ships.
By 1351, the first great wave of the plague began to recede. It didn't disappear entirely. It would return in smaller, localized outbreaks for centuries to come. But the initial, continent-spanning pandemic burned itself out. The world it left behind was a quieter, emptier place. The exact death toll is impossible to know, but modern historians estimate that the Black Death killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population. In some areas, entire villages were wiped off the map, leaving behind only overgrown fields and silent, empty houses. The psychological shock was immense. The world suddenly seemed random, cruel, and meaningless. The institutions people had trusted, the church, the state, the medical authorities, had all been proven utterly helpless. This profound crisis of faith and authority led to massive social and economic changes. Before the plague, Europe had a large peasant population with not enough land to go around. This meant lords and landowners held all the power, and wages were pitifully low. But after the plague, the situation was reversed. There was a severe labor shortage. Suddenly, the peasants who had survived were in high demand. They could demand higher wages, better working conditions, and more freedom. When the nobility tried to pass laws to freeze wages and force people back into their old roles, it sparked widespread anger and, in some places, outright rebellion. The old feudal system, which had been in place for centuries, was beginning to crumble. The Black Death, in its own horrific way, had paved the way for the end of the Middle Ages. The world of art and literature was also transformed. The art of the late 14th century became obsessed with death. A new theme emerged, the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, which depicted skeletons gleefully leading people from all walks of life, popes, kings, peasants, children, to their graves. It was a grim reminder that death was the great equalizer. The optimism of the early Renaissance was replaced with a more somber, pessimistic worldview. The experience was so traumatic, so all-encompassing, that it would echo through the European consciousness for generations. The world before the plague, with its certainties and its hierarchies, was gone forever. And what of the ghost ship that started it all? Its ultimate fate is unknown. The galley that brought the plague to Messina was last seen being driven out of the harbor, a floating coffin sent back to the sea. It likely drifted for a time, a true ship of the dead, until a storm or the simple passage of time broke it apart and sent it to the bottom of the Mediterranean. It disappeared without a trace, its name and its captain lost to history. All that remains is its legacy, a legacy of profound and terrible change, carried across the waves from a distant shore. It serves as a quiet, chilling reminder of how fragile our world can be, how a microscopic organism hitching a ride on a flea, on a rat, on a ship, can bring an entire civilization to the brink. It's a strange and sobering thought to end on, but it is, after all, just a story now, a whisper from a long-gone world, a world that recovered and rebuilt, and eventually forgot what it was like to be so afraid of an unseen enemy. The bells of Messina have long since fallen silent. The plague pits have become parks and fields. The world moved on. And now the story is over. There is nothing left to do but let the silence settle around you. Let the darkness be a comfort, and let yourself drift off to sleep.